Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to spend the next hour with you talking about the power of behavioral insights and how they can change your thinking, your decision-making, and help us make better policies. My name is Iris Bohnet. I'm a professor here at the Kennedy School. I'm also the co-director of BIG, which is the Behavioral Insights group that I co-direct with Max, who's sitting right there. And I'm also director of the Women and Public Policy program. Let me start by introducing our panelists tonight. On my left, we have David Halpern, who is the chief executive of the Behavioral Insights team in the United Kingdom and also the board director. He's led the team since its inception in 2010. And prior to that, David was the founding director of the Institute for Government and also served as the chief analyst at the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. Before that, David enjoyed some time in academia. Sadly, for all of us, left academia, but he held tenure at Cambridge and visiting positions at various other universities, including here at Harvard. Odette van der Riet, in the middle right there, is the leader of the Netherlands BIT team, which is housed in the Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment. Odette has a background in political science, in civil engineering, and her PhD is in policy analysis, something very close to my heart, and I hope to the heart of many students here in the audience. She's also been in academia, teaching at Delft University of Technology, has served at RAND Europe and a number of other policy institutes. To your far right, you have Max Bazerman, who, as I said, co-directs our Behavioral Insights group here at the Kennedy School and is also the co-director of the Center for Public Leadership here at the Kennedy School. But truth be told, we're kind of borrowing him from the business school, where he's the Jesse Isidor Strauss Professor of Business Administration. Max has written a lot on decision-making, negotiation, and more recently on ethics, and in fact is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 20 books. Most recently, a book that we'll talk about a little later that is called The Power of Noticing. So, we, the three of us here, and a number of people here in the audience come from a conference that focused on behavioral insights here at Harvard, where we had not just the people here on stage, but about 50 participants really from around the world, from behavioral insights teams from academia, and from governments from around the world thinking about creating a behavioral insights team and learning from the guests we have here tonight. However, as you probably know, our favorite methodology in studying behavioral insights are experiments. So even at the conference, we were subjected to experimentation without our knowledge. And one fun experiment that some of us were part of was an experiment about noticing. Many of you must have seen or are familiar with a famous study where a gorilla jumps through a film. People are playing basketball, and a gorilla jumps through, and most people don't see the gorilla. Sometimes it's a woman, there's other people kind of running through, but people have a hard time focusing on a task and at the same time noticing what's happening around them. So to illustrate this, I want to show you a short film that was made at the conference that we just come from with the conference participants who all study behavioral insights and who think a lot about these biases. And you will see how many of them are biased and how many are completely rational. So if you could show that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, I do. I just grab your folder and you can sign a video release form. It's just for internal filming.
Today's the 21st, is that right?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Showing it there now. So those of you who are studying at Harvard might have recognized some of your faculty members, so please keep that a secret. Some of them are here on stage, but we won't go further into the participants. But in any case, it obviously is hard to notice. And it's not actually true that the failure rate was 100%, but some people did come up to the organizers over lunch and said, "There's something, wasn't that something strange happened over lunch?" And so very few people noticed. But Max, did you notice?
I think they saw I did not notice.
So you're not one of the ones who talked with the organizer over lunch?
Absolutely not. I did not notice. I didn't come close to noticing, and I bet they could pull that on me again.
So Max, writing a book on noticing is not really a self-help strategy.
It was a self-help strategy. It didn't work.
Tell us more about your book. Why is it so hard to notice? What is going on in our minds that this is so hard to do?
So I think that most of us have been rewarded for being focused, and that certainly includes me. And the book is really about the fact that leaders need to not only focus, but occasionally pick up their head and notice other information around them. Now, I could come up with defensive reasons why I didn't notice here, but I think the critical issue is to realize the magnitude by which people don't notice information that would surprise them, and figure out how are we going to notice when there's interesting opportunities. You're soon going to be talking to experts on the world of noticing what's wrong in government and figuring out how to create interventions to make things better. And that process really has to start by noticing that there's a missed opportunity, that things could be a lot better than they are, rather than just assuming the way the government works is fixed.
So Max, are you suggesting that we can teach people to notice?
Yeah.
Or we can?
Yeah, there's a J-term course about that very topic. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll get back to your course maybe a little later. But yes, so we can teach people how to notice, but we might also be able to teach people how to change the environment to make it easier to notice.
But we would have to notice what the opportunities are to identify what changes to the environment to make.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, David, let me turn to you. I mean, you are kind of all about kind of choice architecture. You are fixing the environment, not just to help us notice better, but to fix many other problems. Why is why do you focus on the environment? Why don't you focus on people?
Well, we obviously do focus on people sometimes. Just for a lot of issues, it's, I mean, it depends what exactly the behavior is, but quite often your best strategy is to minimize the effort on the person to have to make a change. I mean, the good everyday example that's pretty familiar and rehearsed in many governments is the issue of obesity. It's extremely difficult and effortful to change your diet. You can learn that actually you should not bring the whole pack of cookies into the, you know, when you're watching TV. Otherwise, they will all disappear. You can, you know, and just only take a few of them. But generally, it's effortful and difficult, right, as opposed to if you can lead to a kind of cascade of consequences which drives, you know, product reformulation and so on, then you're likely to have a much bigger effect. So we obviously look at both those things. We try and understand the nature of the behavior. Often we are trying to affect people's behavior to get them to pay their tax on time or get a job faster. But often the best strategy is often changing the environment itself.
Odette, tell us a bit more about how you do that in the Netherlands. So clearly the Netherlands recently introduced the Behavioural Insights unit, which is very, very exciting. What are some of the questions that you want to tackle?
Well, we try to take an integral view on policy issues, taking all insights into account, including behavioral insights, but also the other insights that are relevant. And only then you can come to effective policy making. If you take only a technical view, then okay, you understand the technical system, but you don't know much about behavior yet. So you have to dig into that subject. And that nicely fits also with my own background, which you just mentioned. It's a policy analysis background. And then you take that holistic perspective, taking all relevant insights into account.
But tell us a bit more about your personal journey to behavioral insights. I imagine many of the participants of tonight here, for some of them, behavioral insights is kind of something that they've been familiar with for a while, but for many, this is a relatively new concept. So how, I mean, you started out with technology. How did you become intrigued by behavioral insights?
It was 2009, and there was a conference in the Netherlands, and Max was speaking there. Do you remember, Max?
Very nice visit.
Netherlands is a nice country. This was a follow-up of, this conference was a follow-up of a study, a report from the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policies, a famous council. And they published a report on behavioral insights. And that really put the issue on the policy agenda. Policymakers got intrigued and impressed by it. And so did I. I was at a conference, and that was the first time I saw that gorilla movie you just mentioned. A new world opened for me. I was not aware about the behavioral insights up till 2009. And then at that time, I was a researcher, a program manager at the KIM Netherlands Institute for Transport Policy Analysis, which is a knowledge institute within the ministry. All demand driven, so if there is a question from a policymaker, we start research on it. And after that conference and that report, we got questions from policymakers on this issue. And then we got the opportunity, all demand driven, to write a report on that synthesizes all the behavioral insights that existed and present them in a coherent way so that policymakers could deal with it. And this was a great journey of exploration, this study. It took 2 years, it took a bit long, but it was great, it was fun, and it was, real. This was my journey. A long answer, but it was also a long journey.
Yeah, so it sounds like kind of a combination of personal experience, good evidence, good illustrations of some of the things that are happening that seem to have affected you. I mean, David, you're kind of Mr. Behavioral Insights, of course. You've been doing this for such a long time with such great impact, but have you always cared about how our minds work, or have you always thought that there was a lot of promise in better understanding how our minds work and therefore shaping our environments differently?
Yeah, curiously, actually, I can remember, I think I was 13 or 14, and I found it, I was in this is a long time ago, and I found it, there was a second-hand bookstore I used to go sometimes, and there was, it must have been one of the first editions of David Meyer's book on social psych, don't know how many of you would have read that? Anyway, because I was doing, physics or whatever, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like, it was just amazingly interesting. I think it's for everybody, it's amazingly interesting. So it's fantastic, classic, mainly North American social psychology experiments, right? Unfortunately, it then took me a while to realize that it could be a legitimate form of study as opposed to go to Cambridge and do physics and maths, and then realize actually at some point, oh my God, actually, you could study something which you think is really interesting, as opposed to, I'm sorry, we need a lot more physicists in the world and all that. So yes, I mean, I have obviously been interested, and I was taught it at Cambridge and so on subsequently, but I think one of the interesting puzzles is why it's taken government so long in many places to realize that this body of extraordinarily interesting knowledge about human beings, that this might actually be relevant to people who are trying to make decisions about government and policy and affect behavior. In fact, even today in the conference we were at, we had a good example from another government of somebody who's a very senior figure who literally lived that parallel existence, aware of the literature and doing a day job, and particularly economics, and it hadn't come together somehow. And I think that's kind of fascinating. It's taken so long.
So I want to revisit that point a little later on, but before I go there, let me also ask Max about his journey, because you've been a leading scholar on behavioral insights for so long and have nurtured the field and really created the field. But how did you find this as a home?
So that's kind. So lots of people over the last few decades have cataloged the predictable and systematic ways in which even smart people make mistakes on a regular basis. In this area of behavioral decision research, now more commonly called behavioral economics, really grew up with the idea if we could figure out what people do wrong, we could fix intuition. And so we tried to fix intuition, and there was lots of research on that topic, virtually all of which was a complete and dismal failure. So we knew what the problems were, but we didn't know how to fix it. And W.C. Fields once said, if at first you don't succeed, try again, then quit, no use being a damn fool about it. And that's kind of the history of this area of research. It took a while, but really in the last decade, the field switched in terms of the prescriptive side from fixing intuition to identifying how do we encourage people to switch from system one or intuitive processes to system two or more deliberative processes for important decisions, and how can leaders use our knowledge of how people make decisions to change the structure to lead more people to more good decisions more of the time. And this whole area of behavioral insights is about how do leaders use the tools of understanding how to change the environment that incorporate the way intuition works and use our understanding to create better decisions. So for me, it's kind of following how the field has moved in terms of what we can do about this topic that I've been studying for a long time.
So thank you. So clearly, I think you're probably getting a sense that we're at a very interesting moment kind of for the field and for the world of practice, where many of us are excited about the potential that we might not have felt 10 years ago. And that potential comes from making it easy for people like you and me and everyone in the film, despite our biases and despite how our minds work, to get things right. But of course, the art and craft of doing this is insights into, so what do you do with the environment? How do you change it? How do you make it easy for our minds? So David, tell us more about that. I mean, you've run so many studies, so many trials, so many experiments in very different domains, helping people find work, helping taxpayers pay their taxes. I mean, that's a big help for them. But many other good things. Tell us about how do you find the problems and how do you go about knowing what to change in the environment?
Right, so the work in the last few years, essentially it's two main levels on which it operates. On the one hand, we do quite small nuts and bolts changes, some of which you touched on. And they themselves have delivered often quite powerful results, some of which you may know, so just adding an extra line onto a letter asking people to pay their tax on time, increasing repayment rates quite substantially and reducing complaints, by the way, to changing scripts in a job center, so for someone who's unemployed, to get them back to work faster. And it's also very gratifying, actually, as a policymaker, and you see these results quite fast. We also do work sometimes where you can't do a trial. You have to make a decision, and in which case you're trying to think, rather like Odette was saying, that You're trying to bring to bear all the relevant information, including the behavioural aspects, in order to make a better policy judgment. I mean, how do we go about it? Well, first of all, for us, of course, what's the priority issues for the Prime Minister of the government of Day? But you know, so is it a big issue? Also, is it a substantive issue in the sense that, like, how important will it be? If you can even move, you know, smoking quit rates a very small amount, you know it's going to be very impactful, right? So you should spend time on it. We also, certainly in the early days, we looked at issues where we thought there was good evidence already for it being effective, not least often in North America, and we felt it could be transferable. So a series of different factors in terms of political interest, likely impact, scale of impact, as well as do we think it would be efficacious in a given case. And then both in terms of micro examples and then macro. The only other thing I would just say, which I think many people find in the practitioner world, is that do you have a cooperative partner? Even if you're coming from Downing Street, actually, it doesn't necessarily mean that a department is going to do, shock horror, I think it may be true in the White House, will necessarily cooperate. So you're also looking, given there's so many issues you can apply it for, where is the one where the door, when you push it, is opening? And so that's actually also, in practical terms, a relevant constraint.
So, but you know, I'm an economist by training. It sounds like what economists have been trying to do, at least for a very long time, but only I think you're using different instruments, don't you? Why don't you just rely on incentives or information or regulation or laws? I mean, we have lots of instruments at our disposal, but it strikes me that including an additional sentence on the letter might be a slightly different intervention than an incentive.
So it's really, of course, partly the answer is we'll use any tool we think might be effective, including incentives, although sometimes it can be more effective. But look, a fairly well studied example now across the world is changing the defaults on pensions, where the conventional policy tool is to use a tax subsidy. And we spend very substantial sums in the range, you know, not far off $50 billion odd in the UK, and tax subsidies to encourage people to save more. If we take Raj Shetty's work, say here in Harvard, we can use that to get estimates of what is the effectiveness of it. And it's about 6 cents in the dollar, 6 to 10 cents, right? That's a lot of money to spend for not very much extra saving. In contrast, 2 years ago, we changed the defaults to, it's an opt-out instead of an opt-in, rather like 401, although we've done it at a national level. Millions more people are saving. What is the rate amongst those eligible? It's 91% are staying in. You know, it's not just that it's actually more effective, it is clearly phenomenally more effective. It's also much more cost effective too. So it's a good example. So that's a big example. Sometimes you see micro examples. I'll give you one more. It's an interesting one, I think. We were curious when, lots of places have introduced, as of course you've got here now in Cambridge, is lots of bikes. So you can hire a bike, right? So if you're an economist, you say, what happens if we introduce, as in London, lots and lots of really cheap bikes available? What should that do to bike sales, right? An economist around? It's not difficult to work out. Lots of cheap. Well, as opposed to what's the prediction from a kind of behavioural economic perspective. So, what just happened is the bike sales go down and they go up. They go up quite markedly. Right? Well, you see just social proof, etc. So it's particularly where you're getting these variations, and there are lots of government policies, you'll be amazed to hear, that actually don't work very well. And that's a pretty good place to start, to try, well, why is this not very effective? What else is happening here? And even it turns out, some quite prosaic details were traditionally been regarded. Like how complicated is a form, or can anybody actually understand what they're being asked? Turn out to be incredibly consequential. And in fact, for example, in general, we are neglectful of frictional effects and forces. So it's been very rich territory in the sense of, you've got precious public resources, you're trying to do certain things, you introduce these new models, they are often performing significantly better than the conventional tools.
So we clearly have to revisit your earlier point of why it's so hard for governments to adopt these things, because it sounds like they are cheap and they are effective. So why are we not all doing them? So that's something that I think you all should think about and we should come back to. But before I do that, let me ask Odette about something that I know you've been working on, Odette, and that's kind of the power of social norms or of what the majority is doing. And I think the bike example might be one of them. If everyone is biking and you're the only one not biking, you're starting to feel like an outsider. How has that affected your thinking in terms of designing policies in the Netherlands?
Social proof is a very powerful one. It's often used, for instance, in waste disposal, avoiding that litter is thrown on the street instead of in the container. And in the Netherlands, a couple of years ago, we had a very nice experiment called peak hour avoidance, in Dutch spitsmijden. For, I don't know, are there any Dutch people around? Yeah, two, wow. Spitsmijden Brabant. Peak hour avoidance between two cities in the south of the Netherlands, Den Bosch and Eindhoven. And people got a financial reward if they avoided rush hour. But some of the participants were challenged to submit a personal peak avoidance plan. So they wrote down, you know, how to avoid the peak, the rush hour. And then they submitted the plan to the organization. And then during the experiment, they got feedback on their own travel behavior, but not only on their own travel behavior, also on the travel behavior of others. And I mentioned also that example yesterday, like Mr. Janssen. Janssen's a common name in the Netherlands. Received feedback like, your score is 6.5% less than average. And then I got the feedback from the audience, well, Americans want to be winners. Well, in the Netherlands, we want to be on average. So being less than average, okay, then the people start running. But of course, in the Netherlands, we also have people who want to be the winner, so they want to have the highest score. But at least there is social proof, there's competition, and etc. It worked. And the group that had to deliver, that submitted their personal avoidance plan and got that feedback, etc. Their peak hour avoidance was 27% higher than the other group, which got only the financial reward. So you see here the power of the social proof. And another one I also told at the conference was at the Port of Rotterdam. Shall I also tell that one? It's a
You
nice
go
one.
ahead.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. Yeah, it's so lively, because this was a bit abstract. This is very lively. Port of Rotterdam. I had a photo of dock workers with tattoos on their arms, sitting proud on their electric scooter. Together, all those electric scooters and all those dock workers. And how did they manage it? Well, first of all, there was a financial incentive to buy an electric scooter, but on top of that, they got Lee Towers, for the two Dutch people, famous, a popular Dutch singer, and he promoted the electric scooter and said, you know, nice thing, etc. And then the first one bought that electric scooter, and the others followed. And yeah, there's also a Dutch saying around it: if one sheep crosses the dam, the others follow, and that's what happened. And it's great, this picture, you know, with the, you know, the tattooed dock workers, you know, proud on their electric scooter. Social proof. Yeah,
Well,
social
thank you.
norm.
I think we're all building kind of our arsenal of what kind of things could we all kind of incorporate in our own lives. And so far, I think we've heard the power of defaults, that they're really, really important, and we're kind of lazy and tend to stick with the things that we do now, kind of status quo bias, we sometimes call this. We've also heard some about the power of social norms, which have really been shown in many, many different domains, but also role models. And some of them might feel not so surprising to you. I mean, like, why didn't we think about that earlier? I mean, how hard is it to know that people kind of go with the herd, or that people care about some role models and might copy them? So Max, tell us a bit more about your work on ethics. You chose a hard topic, where I'm not sure my intuition would always be right, but what kind of interventions can we use to make people more honest?
We want to start with simple ones that are likely to work. So the BIT unit, Michael Sanders is over there, and he's involved in a couple of experiments where the intervention is to change the signature from the bottom to the top. So we have lab-based results, colleagues at Harvard and elsewhere, that when people fill out forms, if they have an incentive to lie, many people lie by a little bit. Typically on the ambiguous issues of sort of how many puzzles did you solve, and the ones people almost solve, they kind of take credit for it. So when we give them an opportunity to cheat, they do. In our experiment, people fill out a form and then they sign in at the bottom. And most of you, when you've signed a form saying, I told you the truth, you signed it at the bottom. And that's different than when you're in a court of law in the US where you say, I'm about to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and you say it in advance. So what we've shown repeatedly is that if you take the signature from the bottom saying, I told you the truth, and you put it at the top and say, I'm about to tell you the truth, cheating doesn't disappear, but it drops in half. And we have the same results on an insurance study where people are reporting the odometer reading on their car. And our research team is quite confident, and I think Michael Sanders is optimistic, but we're quite convinced that this is an example where if we understood the psychology of unethical behavior, we should have fixed where you sign long, long, long ago. And it's certainly our expectation that 10 years from now, we'll always be signing, well, probably won't be signing, we'll be clicking at the top, but we'll do it before rather than after, because it turns out that if people are willing to cheat a little bit, they're willing to sign their name. But if they say, I'm going to tell you the truth, they have a greater propensity to do so. So it's, and that set of studies is kind of at the intersection of noticing opportunities to change people's behavior. And it's highlighting the fact that if leaders want more ethical behavior, you might want to change people's hearts and minds, but that might actually be difficult. And you might be able to just change their behavior by changing what the task looks like. And I think it's a job of leaders who want more ethical organizations to use all the tools at their disposal to change people's values, to change people's minds, but also to just change their behavior, skipping hearts and minds if that's the easiest path to more ethical behavior.
So all the interventions that the three of you have mentioned seem to, broadly speaking, make the world a better place. But still, David, now I'm coming back to your earlier comment, clearly not everyone is doing it. So what is hard about using behavioral insights, implementing them, creating a behavioral insights team of the scope and scale of the UK? What can we learn from your success?
Well, so two questions. One is why isn't it happening more widely? I mean, people have very plausible models of human behavior, many of which taught in leading institutions, which just turn out to be quite wrong. So it's rather important. So it's not that people got nothing in their heads as policymakers. They do have various theories. So they just often, indeed in our everyday life, we're often wrong about them. So that creates a strong fixation and anchoring to where we started. We see that in professional practice too, right? It takes a very long time for new practices to diffuse in terms of what's more effective versus less effective practice. So there's that, I think, is not to be underestimated as a force. It took a long time to figure out the bloodletting, might not be the best way of curing people or whatever. And the same may be true for big chunks of economics, for example. So there's that. I mean, if there are other issues too which come into it, which are not to be sniffed at. So in my own view, the politics of it is very important. And we have albeit a small n, we have an example in the UK. So, I mean, when I came into government in 2010 to work for Tony Blair, from Cambridge, having done psych, I thought, well, let's use some of this stuff here. And we did do a paper on behavior change a decade ago. I tell you a story because it makes a point. Why would you not do it? It's because you can look at the UK now and see a success, but actually we also have had problems too. Anyway, I remember coming in to work on the day when it was to be launched, this paper. It had already been leaked, and it was already on the front page of the newspapers. There's a document, it was a think piece, we called it. It wasn't, and in fact, it said on every single page, this is not a statement of government policy. Anyway, good luck with that. We put a one-line reference in it about actually when price signals were effective in changing behavior, and made reference to the fact, would it work in relation to diet and food? I'm not spelling it out anyway. So by the time it was on the front of the Times, it was a big pork pie with Prime Minister's strategy, and it proposes fat tax. Like, it wasn't exactly what it was. But anyway, By the time it was got hold of by then our tabloids, those of you from Britain will know we have these wonderful, institutions, a vibrant press, and they'd taken pictures of the cabinet, all our senior ministers, with an estimate for their weight, and particularly we had quite a large deputy prime minister at the time, Prescott, and so the headline had become, how much fat tax will Preza pay? Anyway, you kind of get the gist of this, and it's kind of spirals along and so, but the Prime Minister felt compelled to say we wouldn't use this kind of behavioural and nudgy stuff or whatever, but it was partly also the political context. So you had an administration on the left, which was generally seen as expanding the role of the state, both through legislation and through spending. Jumping forward to 2010, we have a centre-right government, which is generally its instincts are seen to be reducing regulation, reducing the size of the state. We also have austerity issues. In that context, the use of some of these behavioural nudge approaches turns out to be much easier and more comfortable, actually. So, I mean, there can be lots of reasons to get in the way. It can be lack of expertise. It can be fixation on stuff. The political context can be important too. I mean, I think what I hope and I think we're seeing now is that once at least one or two countries have moved forward using these approaches, they seem to be very effective, and the public are generally comfortable with these applications. We're seeing it spread very rapidly through a number of other countries. It's much easier to, at least, to follow and adopt afterwards.
Odette, tell us about how the Behavioural Insights team in the Netherlands was created.
Well, the success of BIT UK was was the impetus for the creation of a behavioural insight team within our ministry. And the decision was a decision by the top management of our ministry, so not the politicians, but the top civil servants. And their goal is that behavioural insights are taken into account on a structural basis in policy making, so that you take that wider view. That's the goal. And to facilitate that, to support that, a behavioural insight team was installed. And then the first year was just, as a kind of an experiment, just starting, light, also in a network form, so that you make maximum use of the existing people and knowledge, etc., and bring that together. And then the second year, we went to level 2 in game terms. And now we are approaching year 3, and there's currently a dialogue going on what's the next step. Because there is really a great, the policymakers really are intrigued by the value of taking behavioral insights into account. And they want more.
So in fact, let me ask a last question to all the panelists before I open the floor. Building on what you just said, so what is the next step, right? Lots of successes, particularly in the UK, but Singapore, Australia, the Netherlands, Germany is building a behavioral insights team. So many kind of exciting kind of movements, lots of experimentation, particularly for me as an academic, very exciting that practitioners and academics work so closely together. But what's the next frontier? What are the challenges and how can we overcome them, or how can we grow this? Or what are you all thinking about kind of the next chapter? Max?
So there's this enormous question of generalizability, because we have so many success stories from the BIT unit in the UK. So a fundamental question is, how much of this can we just import throughout the world? And my best guess is an awful lot of it. So if we go back to laboratory research, there was an awful lot of laboratory research done with college undergraduates, and sort of decades later, it turns out that it generalized to real-world behavior just fine. And I think that that's because Harvard undergraduates are people too. And a lot of what we're studying are aspects of human behavior. So I think a lot of what happens in the UK is going to replicate in lots of other places as well. That doesn't mean that there won't be differences. And there is a literature on cross-cultural differences in this world. So I think that we're going to observe those. I think we're going to learn more about what are the patterns where we need to be culturally sensitive, and what are the opportunities where we can just sort of adapt the amazing research that exists on defaults and social norms, et cetera, et cetera. What's a laundry list of stuff that there's just no reason not to move fast on generalizing to other countries, and where do we need to learn to be culturally sensitive? We'll also see a literature develop just predicting what kind of nudges are most likely to be effective. So right now, the scientific use is still an art form on the front end of which topics do we go after, and I think that we'll see more systematic study of that over the upcoming years.
Let me ask you kind of a short follow-up question. Do you think leaders will use this or will find this a useful tool to become more effective as leaders?
Yes, as our students get older. As you know, Iris, you and I are guilty of starting this entity called the Behavioral Insights Group a year and a half ago. And what we're guilty of is that we created a research unit, and we thought about the faculty, the 25 faculty members around campus who do field experiments for the public good. And it was after we had launched this entity that students started to show up, Robert Reynolds repeatedly, but other students as well, saying, but what are you doing about students? And I said, what students? And it quickly became clear that Behavioral Insights and the work of David Halpern and Thaler and Sunstein's book Nudge and Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow had permeated the culture of the Harvard Kennedy School to a degree that I certainly had no idea existed. And so the teaching side is a wonderful opportunity and challenge that we just didn't see coming, certainly this quickly. So I think that as the people who are getting master's degrees at the Harvard Kennedy School now end up in positions of leadership, I think that this will permeate along with it. Certainly there are people who are older than our students who will sort of pick up on the theme, and we see a lot of that occurring as we go. But it's always the next generation that's easiest to sell on innovative ideas.
Thank you. Odette, where do you see us going?
Well, many ways. But one challenge is, of course, to break the routines in policy making, so that time and resources are built in the policy making process to do proper analysis, to do proper evaluation. That's an investment, and there is a high return on investment. It pays off, later on, but it's a pre-investment. And policymakers are also human beings, and human beings tend to jump to conclusions, and you have to break that routine, and that's a challenge. It's a challenge.
Yeah. David, what are your last words of wisdom for us, our panel here? Where are we going?
Look, we're going to see spreading, deepening, and actually the other area which we can talk about is democratizing, actually, I think, which is worth thinking about. Max has talked about the spreading. I mean, we're seeing this moving across the world. I mean, we ourselves now help many other governments. There's at least a dozen, I think, we're probably working with at the moment, which is great. Inside the UK, I mean, to me, the half-full version of it is, look, there are lots of examples. We've done 100-odd control trials in the last year, let alone lots of policy changes. But to me, I also can see the swathes of policy areas which we've hardly touched. If you take even something simple like healthcare, if more than 3/4 by some estimates of years of healthy life lost are to known behavioural factors, is that where we spend our money? Is that where we spend even our research money? For the most part, not. In terms of honesty, we often design our whole tax and benefit systems which inadvertently signal we don't trust you all the time, which looks like it might be pretty problematic, it turns out. So there are so many more areas where I think the potential is. But the last one, let me at least mention, which I think is important, maybe in a relatively elite audience, is that if you want to use this stuff, particularly around things which concern lifestyle choices for the public, I mean, who the hell am I, or us even, to make those decisions, It does require public permission too. It's very important that governments be very open about this. It's very important they be, quite sincere about asking the public, well, look, this is what the evidence suggests. We think this would be much more effective, but what do you guys think? The reason why I feel we were able to sustain the position on default on pensions is there was a really good, genuine public consultation where to some extent the public, when shown the evidence, said, well, look, in which case, why don't you change the default? But if you want to get onto an issue like obesity or lifestyle, if government starts saying, hey, we've got a solution, we're going to get rid of all that chocolate and sweets by the checkout, right? Like, I mean, that might work pretty well. But if the public aren't behind that and they don't recognize the behavioral forces, then actually governments are quite limited in how far they can go. So, as I said, spreading, I think deepening, there's so much more. It's an exciting time for those of you interested in this to go into this area because there is so much more to be pursued. But as I said, I think we also have to have a kind of humility and a preparedness to take our cue often from the public as well. And there's not been enough of that yet.
Thank you very much. With that, let us open to questions that you might have. There are 4 microphones, 2 here on the ground floor and 2 right up there. If you could please introduce yourself with your name and ask one question that ends with a question mark. I'll start right there, please.
Good evening. My name is Nicholas. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. And I have a question about the way neuroscience and big data are informing of your field. We see that we hear a lot about how big data is going to transform policy making, about and how neuroscience are going to transform policy making. And I was wondering if you could touch upon this aspect to the panel.
Yeah. Anyone?
Well, to the top of my head, I'm going to be heretical. I actually think neuroscience is having relatively modest impact. And I actually find sometimes it's frustrating that, you know, get a brain scan into your paper or whatever, do something on CT scan. And it is, of course, producing some interesting things. But in many areas, it feels like there are a lot of quite straightforward insights that can be got from genuine, direct behavioral measures. I actually find it slightly frustrating sometimes in terms of the sheer amount of research that's going into certain kinds of neuroscience as opposed to, you know, actually in real-world contexts to try and see some behavioral effects. You also mentioned about data, however, where I think that's a slightly different story. The ability to get, without a much lower cost, to be able to do trials, to test out things, to, of course, segment and work out, well, what works for who, raising the possibility of personalized defaults and so on, is incredibly powerful. And so if you like, my challenge back to you would be, if I would be quite like to take a bit of that resource from neuroscience and apply it actually in some slightly more prosaic ways around behavior change, including some big data sets in more everyday life. That's only my own view.
So I agree with David currently. So I don't get much insight out of neuroscience about what interventions I think would be most useful. On the other hand, I'm a little bit, I feel like I don't know the area well enough. And I remember 30 years ago when sort of more of a cognitive revolution was occurring rather than a neuro revolution, and people who did social science in less cognitive ways were very suspicious about cognitive methods. So my reaction is we need to wait, and it's clear that neuroscience is an enormous basic field, and whether or not it produces results that dramatically change professional contexts, I think, is up for grabs. Big data is, I think, a very different issue. The number of young colleagues I have who find ways of doing the kind of work we're talking about, but in ways that I just wouldn't imagine on my own, I find astonishing. So my colleague at HBS, Mike Luca, sort of figured out that most cities are inspecting health departments in a very strange way, or are inspecting restaurants in a very strange way, kind of randomly, when he noted that if you send robots into Yelp overnight, you can find that customers will tell you where all the dirty restaurants are, and there's no reason to do a random search when the data already exists on Yelp. I mean, sort of, that's just a big data solution that nobody my age would have ever thought of before. And so I think that there's amazing things happening with big data, but I think you should ask people kind of under 35 what those things are.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, thank you for all of your comments in the talk so far. I thought this was really good. My name is Nicholas Bergfeld. I'm a joint policy and medical student. And my question has to do with the fact that, you know, BIT and the projects that you guys are doing right now, I love a lot because you guys are the good guys. Because I trust your ethics and I trust your morality. I think you're doing the right things. But in terms of mass manipulation of individuals and people, you know, there's been a long history of that throughout human history, right? I mean, to me, when I think about, say, Nazi Germany, there's so many examples of psychology that were, or ways that things were being incorporated in policies that effectively were not necessarily for good purposes, right? So, I mean, for example, individuals who are going into concentration camps were told, write your name on your luggage so that whenever you come back to get your luggage later, you'll know where it is. Because they found that if they had people do that, they would stay in the lines better, and they would actually go through faster, and they wouldn't complain as much because, oh, they thought there's something I could ground myself towards. And so I wonder, what are sort of specific things in your mind or recommendations in order to sort of like make sure that those types of things don't happen again?
Thank you. Big question. Who would like to take a stab at it?
It's a very profound, sad example, isn't it? Look, I mean, remember, it's true for most forms of knowledge, right? I mean, governments can be abusive in it, and we need to make sure there are a lot of other things that get thought about in this institution that are important about well-functioning government and accountability. I mean, as I've already mentioned, I actually think for lots of reasons, including that, but also just in terms of efficacy, one of the things that needs to happen is that if governments want to use these approaches, they need to be very open about it. They often need permission from the public to enhance it, to use these types of approach. And I think that's, you know, sort of deeply true. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. I think that's, yeah.
So some people claim that private corporations have long used these strategies to sell useless and dangerous products to an unsuspecting consumer. And if that might be true, the question is that people who have a mind of the public good at heart, do you want them to start using these tools as well? For me, the Nazi example is feels a little bit overboard, and yeah, okay. That wasn't a complaint. Just my reaction is it's overboard, in the sense that obviously we don't want something like that to happen again. But I don't have any reason to believe that behavioral insights are going to increase the likelihood of something terrible happening again. I've taught negotiations most of my career, and like most of the negotiation teachers that you've had at Harvard, we tend to focus more on value creation rather than value claiming, but we certainly cover the board. And I have no doubt that my teaching on negotiations can be used for bad. But if I think that the weight of the information is much more likely to be used for the good than for the bad, then I want to take that risk. That's kind of the business that we're in. And going to the extreme, sort of bad guys knowing how to do arithmetic well helps them do bad, but we're not going to stop teaching arithmetic.
And to build on it, in the Netherlands, recently a report came out, and the main message is the ethical issue is crucial. And that actually holds for all policy making. And with nudges, you have to be very careful. But it holds for all policy making.
I'm going to add a very small footnote that I always use when I teach decision making here at the Kennedy School. And that is that nudges when you think about going from A to B, nudges cannot be about defining B. They have to be about how to get from A to B. B has to be defined by some other process, and I think David has talked about that. Has to be defined by some democratic process of what B should be, and then nudges are an instrument to make sure we get from A to B more effectively. Sorry, I'm the moderator, so I'll hold back on my own comment.
Just one tiny thing to add on this is just to say, I mean, obviously, as you say, we take our instructions essentially from democratically elected figures, and there have been times when we've worked out something which we are really sure would be highly effective as a nudge, and an elected minister said, no, actually, we don't want to do that. We think for some reason, maybe ethical, or we were worried about public reaction, we don't want to do that. So, you know, we've got to have those pieces in place, right?
And, yeah, maybe also now, sometimes policies are developed and people are not aware that there are nudges in that policy. Not on purpose, not with intention, but are in it. Yeah. So that's why it's so crucial to take the ethical aspect into account in all policy making, and also be aware about intentional, unintentional nudges. Always. It's a crucial issue.
Thank you.
But always.
Thank you. Please.
Absolutely. So just like Nick, I'm also a medical student slash Kennedy School student here, my 5th year. David, you talked about spreading and deepening, moving forward, and sort of that being the next phase. And I think, you know, there's a contingency of us here from the medical schools who are thinking that this is going to revolutionize the way that we treat patients. It's going to revolutionize the way we do healthcare. And we're sort of the ones that are sort of carrying the flag, trying to figure out how we can bring this to medicine. What are the applications? 2 questions there. The first, what things are you guys most excited about at the intersection of sort of behavioral science and healthcare? And then the second, what sort of insights or advice would you have for us as we move into sort of bring this field of knowledge to our field of knowledge and hope to kind of marry the two?
Shall I start? I mean, look, I think I agree with you. I mean, I already touched on the issue of public health. And I think one of the great challenges, look, you presumably went into the profession because you want to heal and you want to, like, if you're standing back from what are the things that you can do. So there are at least 3 levels, I think, at the intersection with behavioral science, let me just say. So first of all, there's interesting work, as I'm sure you probably know, about clinical practice, decision trees, for example, issues where around the dynamics in hospitals be incredibly important. We've done work on clinical errors, which turns out there's a lot of, and even quite simple things that can improve that. So there's sort of in clinical practice, there's a lot of so-called service improvement issues. So, for example, reducing the number of people who don't turn up from their appointments. We did trials where you test different kind of messages and texts, right? And it turns out big effects. So if you say, you know, in the British system, remember, it's state, it's all paid for. But, you know, so it's one that says, you know, please turn up because it costs a lot of money if you don't. It doesn't really do very much. If you say, please turn up because it costs this much, you're not paying for it, drops the don't attend rate by about 25% plus, right? So like very small details like that in terms of could be very powerful. But the biggest push is surely around going upstream to the drivers. So I take a concrete example, which we've been engaged in, is electronic cigarettes, right? You know, anyway, the US government, there have been various moves in the US to ban them. Many governments have banned them. We took a decision back in 2010-11 that no, actually on the basis of the behavioral evidence, as well as the early clinical evidence, we should make sure that they are fairly widely available. We're doing that on the basis if you've got an addictive behavior, if we can drive to substitution, and you know, you might not want your kids to use e-cigarettes, but they're much less harmful. I mean, current estimates in the UK are we're getting 300,000 plus extra people quitting a year as a result of e-cigarettes. You know, there's very few things you can do in health. I mean, if you're the greatest clinician, you're going to struggle to have an impact like that, you know. So to be able to go upstream and think fundamentally about, well, what else can we do to do things on the earlier causes? So I think it's incredibly rich, exciting area. I absolutely agree, and in many layers. And my final point, and it's very striking, I mentioned this in passing even, that we spend a lot of money on health research, right? It is dominated by a certain kind of pharma research, valuable though it is. If you try and line up the etiological effects, you know, against where we're putting our research money versus where's the variance, it looks very strange indeed. So I think in that sense, I hope we'll see a revolution, even just to move a bit in the direction of thinking about the underlying behavioral causes.
I think it's also occurring here. So about 6 feet in front of you is Christine Roberto from the School of Public Health, who does this work to change how we eat. So the world of diet and obesity is what Christine studies. I think Anne Thorndike, who's in the medical school, is using behavioral insights to change medical behavior. I also think of other people who I don't think of as part of the BIT unit, but are working with these concepts. I think of Jerry Avorn, who basically is trying to counteract the fact that doctors pay attention to pharmaceutical reps without realizing that they're doing so by providing an alternative to getting your advice from a pharmaceutical rep, but rather having what Avorn calls an academic rep, as somebody who represents the state of science to tell doctors what drugs to prescribe. So that work is countering a bias that we know exists and is enormously powerful, and docs kind of aren't aware of that. I think that I think one of the amazing effects in the medical world is the degree to which docs have self-serving biases, and I mean psychological rather than financial. That is, that surgeons believe they should operate, and people who have a particular technique believe that that's the right technique. And so there's an awful lot of people getting the wrong treatment. And we know more about that from the decision sciences than we probably do from medicine. And I think that kind of meeting is going to happen over the upcoming years.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions, and we'll go back up there.
Hi, good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Manur Khan, and I'm a sophomore at the college. There was a study published in 2013 by the British Behavioural Analysis Unit on organ donation, and they talked about how if you made small changes to the government website, more people signed up onto the donor registry and donated to the NHS registry. But I was just wondering, in the long run, what are your thoughts on how emphasis on research like this can affect things like the electoral process and how politicians launch campaigns, just generally?
Max, do you want to? We have a colleague who's we have a colleague who's.
So first of all, it's a wonderful study. I've seen David present it a couple of times, and he presents it in an amazing way that sets me up to make the wrong decision about predicting which treatment will work. I think that there is a frustration. I think we know how to increase organ donations. So changing the default creates a bigger effect than the treatments that exist within the British study. I think there's a variety of things we can do, many of which are politically unpalatable. And I think one of the good products that can come out of the behavioral insight teams that are represented by the 2 people to my right is that if we can change the public's view of how do we create the greatest good for government, it may not be in the interests of politicians to oppose wise changes because of the gory story that the opposition can present in return. So I actually think that making government work more effectively, turn to topics like the ones that you address, might be able to get rid of the politically motivated behavior that's probably killing thousands of extra Americans every year, and you can multiply it as you go across more countries.
I mean, on the specifics of the study, yes, it's actually had probably disproportionate attention across the world, organ donation, including the creation of new channels. That was also the study you're referring to. Turns out, by the way, of an 8-arm trial, the most effective one was to use reciprocity. Say, would you have an organ if you needed one? If so, why don't you join the register? Anyway, worth knowing. So, but your key question really was the use of those approaches in voting. I mean, remember some differences in the way the British system is structured, so we don't do anything on voting. We've done some stuff on voting registration, but we just don't. It's a kind of political line in the sand. Now, of course, in the US especially, there's a huge amount of work going on precisely on those sorts of issues. You'll see it arising around the world also, for example, on referendum. What's the wording of a referendum? We had a referendum recently. We didn't write the wording of it ourselves, but you can imagine there are questions. Well, which way do you word it? How will it affect it? I mean, those things will, I think, carry on and fine and legitimate. So, one of the lasting legacies, I think, of this approach, though, in case it doesn't come up later, but isn't just the specifics of the organ donation. As such, it's the use of those kind of methods that, not just for voting, but in many areas, it is possible to use the experimental method to figure out what is a more effective way of doing lots of things. Yes, you can do it for voting, but there are so many other issues within mainstream government policy where it can be effective. And then the last thing I might just say is that, because you've got Todd Rogers here, who's done a fantastic, really interesting work in that area. I mean, as far as my interpretation of it, he's decided, imagine doing it the other way. Take all that things we learn on voting, and now he's busy trying to figure out, in fact, he's working with us a lot in the UK, on education, to get kids to turn up at school more often, to be more enthusiastic, and to mobilize the networks around the kids. So I actually think, I know you were worried about going one way, but I actually think there's a lot to be said from taking the learning from the voting literature and applying it to lots of other things that look pretty important.
Thank you. Last question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Gabriel Aguirre. I'm a student of the Master in Public Administration and International Development at the Kennedy School, which is basically applied economics to development. And one of our main objectives is to seek development for people, for individuals. And what we usually use in economics is maximizing individual utility, but this is based on a series of assumptions on economic variables such as utility maximization, profit maximization. And what I think about behavioral insights is precisely that we're diverging from something as rational and production-oriented as this. So what I'm getting from this also is that we're focusing on how to use behavior as a tool to advance different objectives, policy making. I'm trying to understand how can we also use behavior as an objective in order to understand what is it that actually people prefer, if it's just utility maximization, rational function, or if it's something that has to do with behavior, and how can we apply this to that?
So I think that we're generally trying to move people's behavior to the behavior that they would choose for themselves with more reflection. So I don't assume that people act rationally to begin with. I assume that we know systematic and predictable ways in which they depart from that. In the developmental context, sort of over-discounting the future is an enormous effect. And so I think what we're hopefully trying to do is to help people move toward decisions that they would make with more deliberation from a long-term perspective. And in many cases, that coincides with a broader public interest as well. There may be times when the broader public interest diverges from the individual self-interest, but those tend to not be the nudges that are most appealing, because there are so many out there that allow for the benefit of both the individual who's targeted by the nudge, but also for the overall society.
Yeah, it all starts with a good understanding of how do people behave and what factors affect that. Why do they behave as they behave? And if you delve into that, then you will also find points of leverage, factors that you maybe can change. But it all starts with that analysis to get a good understanding of what is the current behavior exactly, what do people do? And then why do they do what they do? And to take a broad view on that and also look at it from a user perspective. So not from your policy perspective or whatever perspective, but from that person's perspective. That's the key. So take all your assumptions, put all your assumptions aside and dig into the subject.
David?
We had two goes at answering your question. So one, the phrase that was used by British Prime Minister David Cameron and Clegg when the new government was formed in 2010 was supporting people to make better choices for themselves. Now we know that's quite a complicated thing to pick apart, but there's something about the essence of it which is a simple idea. And it's worth thinking about a lot of our work. In fact, governments are drawn into this because there are so many actors who are busy persuading you left, right, and center, right? Particularly in consumer markets. And one of the most straightforward but really important areas for behavioral insights is designing markets that enable people to essentially maximize their utility more straightforwardly. So there are lots of markets which are subject with lots of consumer detriment because they are complicated. And one in the UK has been a really big one is the energy markets. Right? So we deregulated the energy markets more than a decade ago, 6 major suppliers and so on. Most people would save several $100s if they switch, but only 1 in 10 a year do it, right? So what's going on there? Well, there's a huge amount of friction when you try and switch, like, do you know this number, do you know that, right? So we've introduced a clause called the My Data clause, which is if a company holds lots of your data about you, and it's in machine-readable form linked to you, then you should also be able to get it in machine-readable form. And that might sound very boring, but it's actually a game changer because you're taking out friction. So what this means is that when you get your electricity or gas bill, you will shortly have a QR code which has got a summary of all the information on it. So what these people most people want to switch, they just couldn't be bothered, it was pain. You can just put your phone against it and it'll say, the best tariff for you is the following, would you like to switch? Oh yeah, click here. You can see how it changes the market fundamentally, actually makes it operate, and at its core is a sort of behavioral insight because of how important frictional factors are, and they've been, in our view, systematically underestimated. So there's lots of kind of micro examples of that which are really powerful and important, but let me just get to a different one because you mentioned the word utility. So At the same time, there's been a lot of interest in well-being, actually alternative measures of well-being. We've instituted quite a big measurement program of well-being, asking people, you know, on a regular basis, how happy are you, how anxious are you, are you satisfied with your life, and so on and so on, to start to bring up that data. And part of it is actually a process of de-shrouding. So we put up a nice graph. We're not going to tell people exactly what to do, but you know, if you're 18, you're trying to decide what to do with your life, you can easily look out, you know, what's the relative earnings in different professions. Well, now you can also look at the life satisfaction of people in different professions. In fact, we can see in the data when people switch to a profession which has got higher life satisfaction on average, theirs moves as well. So it's a way of enabling people, just de-shrouding in some ways, to make those choices more effectively. So I think as I said, it's really rich territory. Maybe my closing comment, if we're closing, is that one of the great things, of course, we've got this work we're doing, an ongoing relationship with Harvard and between BIT, with Sloan Foundation have been supporting a lot of exchange. And one of the things we hope that is not just at top-level faculty. We have PhD students coming over on a regular basis, spend time with us, do trials, and so, you know, long may it continue. If you're interested in this stuff, you're excited to stay, let somebody know.
Thank you. Any last words of wisdom?
Not me.
Okay. Well, Max, thank you very much for the wisdom that you all have shared with us tonight. Thank you for coming and have a good night.